Alright, High Levels Golden Child. This is arguably the simplest game mode, so I'm going to try and touch on some more advanced topics in this video. If you don't have much comp experience, I'm confident I'll give you some new ideas to chew on. How does this game mode work? Paint 70% of the zone, you gain control of it, and it flips to your color. While you control the zone, your score ticks down. If the opponents paint 50% of the zone, it neutralizes, and then if the opponents gain control of zone, i.e. they get 70% of it, then you get a number of penalty points equal to 75% of the points you scored, including any penalty points you chewed through. Now, this doesn't really matter, but if your push started from 100 points, you get one extra penalty point added to that total, which can create some funny situations like this.
How do you have penalty? How do you have plus more than 100? Huh?
When nobody's in control of the zone, the losing team gets a very slight passive special charge, and when one team is in control of the zone, the other team gets a more meaningful passive special charge. Okay, strategy. Start of the match, on most maps with most comps, we want to try and cap a zone. Once zone is flipped, we suddenly have a big burst of paint in the middle, which is a slight advantage. In a perfect world, we use that advantage to take good fights and get space in front of the zone, but on a lot of maps that can be really difficult. Some maps, like Hagglefish, are basically a glorified hallway, and it can be really difficult to move through the zone when the enemies are actively trying to zone you out, even if you've gotten that paint control. I guess now is a good time to talk about how doing the objective is a disadvantage. This is the game mode in which it is the least a disadvantage, but the concept is still applicable. In life in general, and Splatoon is a subset of that, you're bound by the fact that doing something takes time, and often you can't do two things at the same time. So doing the objective, painting the zone, is a disadvantage because it's something you have to do. Most notably, it's often mutually exclusive with fighting. The way you paint, if you're trying to just paint as quickly as possible, is different from the way you paint when you're trying to keep yourself safe. And in many situations, if you're really trying to keep yourself safe, you have to focus on shooting at the enemies pushing you in order to zone them out. So if we have the zone, we can take fights with the enemy to force them to fight us instead of painting the zone. And we don't care that we're fighting instead of painting the zone because we already have the zone. So we aren't even pressured to win these fights, we just want to make them last as long as possible so the enemies are stuck not being able to paint the zone. You can see pretty clearly from these examples how clearing the person who's fighting you is a prerequisite for painting the zone. So if you're a weapon that doesn't paint very well, often the best way for you to paint is to either fight the enemy weapon that paints the best, or stop the enemies from fighting your teammate that paints the best. As a shot player, I am begging all of the midlines out there to make space for me. Now, I said you often can't do two things at the same time, but if the enemies are pushing you through the zone, you can be fighting with them and zoning them out while also contesting zone. This is kind of the same principle as clumping. If you're clumping with the zone, the opponents can shoot the zone and you at the same time. On a lot of maps, this is pretty unavoidable. The zone is a big part of mid, and in order to fight the opponents, you have to move through mid. But it's still something to keep in mind. All else being equal, you want to try and avoid being in the zone. Also worth noting, when you die, you explode an enemy ink, so if you die on zone, this can help the enemies cap big time. Check out this clip, where the only way the enemies could possibly avoid getting KO'd is if they get a kill on zone. Okay, so ideally, if you have the zone, you don't want to clump on it, so that the enemies have to choose between painting the zone and fighting you. So, pretty logically, your end goal after getting some sort of advantage to do so is to get space in front of the zone. This way, the opponents literally can't shoot at the zone because they have to get through you first. They have to spend time and resources displacing you, and then they won't have those resources for the zone. When you're in a position like that, on a hold, your focus needs to be on surviving. If you take really committal fights in front of the zone and die, the opponents can just run straight to zone. But if you just focus on living, backing up, and giving space whenever you're about to die, it'll take the opponents a lot longer to get to the zone and you'll score more points. I'll go more in depth on this in a video about special usage in general, but the last thing I want to mention about holds before we move on is it's good to save your specials until the opponents commit to a retake, and then use those specials to counteract theirs. Let's talk for a little bit about retakes. First though, Terraria pickaxe power. Please don't click off this video, this is relevant, I promise. In Terraria, pickaxes have a stat called pickaxe power. So the copper pickaxe has 35% pickaxe power, the vortex pickaxe has 225%. Different materials require different levels of pickaxe power to mine. Hellstone, for example, requires 65% pickaxe power, whereas lizard bricks require 210%. Okay, here's the point of the metaphor. If I try and mine these lizard bricks with something that only has 200% pickaxe power, I'm not going to mine it 95%, I'm going to mine it 0%. Splatoon isn't quite so Boolean, but very generally speaking, if you try and retake with 90% of the resources you need to retake, you aren't going to get 90% of the retake. You're going to get nothing. And then now you won't have as many resources. So like we've talked about with every video, don't push before you're ready. As you get better at the game, you'll get better at recognizing exactly when you can start executing your retake, and it's definitely possible to wait too long. But generally, from what I've seen coaching low-level teams, most games are lost because people go too early, lose their resources, and stagger. And so hand in hand with that, don't hyperfixate on points. I'd rather give up lead waiting for the right moment than kill myself trying to make something happen and get KO'd. This also applies during your retake. Like we talked about earlier, if you try and cap zone on a retake, the opponents can just fight you. So usually what you want to be playing for is winning fights and getting space, and then capping zone, instead of the inverse order. This goes pretty hand in hand with special usage, especially in the context of zones cheese. Throwing strikes or booyah at zone, or sliding zone, doesn't always take space as well as placing those specials elsewhere. If you slide the zone, insta-cap it, but then die and the opponents flip the zone back, I mean, cool, you've given them some penalty points, but you've died and gone down a special, so you're even further from being ready to retake than before you use that special. You would only want to slide zone in emergencies to buy time for the rest of your teammates to get ready to retake, or if you're in a situation where your teammates can move up with the slider and get space with it. Or if the opponents aren't in a position to punish it, etc., etc. Splatoon is messy, I can't go into all the hypotheticals. But generally, you want to be using your specials for space instead of for paint. Having said all that, there can be merit in going for zone first. If you think you can flip the zone quickly before the opponents can fight you off of it, having that extra paint control can help in the ensuing fight for space, and it gives the opponent some penalty points just in case you lose those fights. Alright, let's look at some examples. Here, I'm the last one alive in a random corner of the map. The safe play would be to jump out, but I've just used my Zuka, meaning if I die, we aren't losing that resource. So I decide to try and drag attention. I'm playing away from the zone, and away from where the enemies would want to be pushing, so if they want to clear me, they're effectively giving up space. I end up trading out, and my teammates don't have to fight anyone to get control over our elbow. This is an example of how I'm not clumping with the space my enemies want to take, so they can't double dip. In this example, I find myself on the left flank with most of my teammates dead. I'm close to my strikes, and it's a 1v3, so fighting here is really risky. It'd probably be best to back up through this flank to my side of zone and regroup with my team. Because that's the best play, the actual best play is to run at my opponents. I'm coming in from this off angle, so you can see the 52 just isn't ready to fight me. I'm pinching not with a teammate, but with zone. The enemy T-Tech threw their strikes onto zone, so I'm choosing to fight for space in front of the zone because if I win those fights, they won't be able to get any space with that special. After cleaning up the gal, you can see the Rapid Blaster had moved up to take space with the strikes, which puts them in a really terrible position to 1v1 my weapon. And even though they capped zone, because I was able to deny them space, the end result is extremely good for my team. That's kind of everything I wanted to talk about in this video. Like I said, it's a lot simpler than the other game modes, but that just means it really lends itself to the fundamentals of the game. As always, I can't go over everything, there are going to be complexities I missed, but keeping these concepts in mind will help you start playing zones like a comp player. That's all for me for now. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.